So, having looked at both the kind of chemistry and history of glass and the way that its manufacture changed with industrialization in the 18th century, I want to take a look now at what ends this material was put to. We saw it used in aristocratic homes in England as both a way to bring daylight into residential interiors and also a way to declare the status of those people inside. And now I want to look at a very kind of burgeoning scientific application of this material to an actual kind of physical problem. The confluence of glass and horticulture in Northern Europe are both outcomes of the kind of Enlightenment trend that both the so-called Age of Exploration, in which case Europeans, quote unquote, discover that there is a whole world that's been getting on for thousands of years out there without them, but also the way that the sort of souvenirs, the botanical souvenirs that they bring back from around the world are housed, both come out of some of the things that we talked about when we discussed the sort of beginnings of engineering, right? That allows European travelers to go much farther, to bring things back. It, of course, means that there is more capital moving around that can afford those sort of voyages. But as we'll see, it's also related to the way that glass is improved, and that finds a very natural kind of pairing in taking care of all of these botanical artifacts that are brought back. There's a real craze during the exploration era for showing off the fruits of these voyages. So bringing back tropical plants, trees, and animals, and showing them off in buildings that have to both protect them from the cold and the climate of Northern Europe, but also to show them off, right? This begins early on, right? The import of orange trees into France as early as the 15th century means that there have to be buildings that are designed to protect these plants in the winter. But it really takes off in the 18th and 19th centuries. There are horticulturists and botanists, gardeners, who take the lead actually in trying to figure out what these plants need, and then in turn how those plants or how the buildings around them can best take advantage of the available technologies there. And as we'll see, this one horticulturalist builder, J.S. Loudon in particular, comes up with this sort of formula that will come to be called the ferro-vitreous tradition, or ferro-vitreous construction in England. And those two words, ferro and vitreous, are Latin for iron and glass. And there's a recognition that these two products of the Industrial Revolution, or these two newly available materials, newly affordable materials, pair with each other really nicely, that the structural efficiency of iron allows much more space on building facades, and the less and less expensive glass allows you to take the entire facade and use it to bring in daylight. Loudon publishes his results. This is another example of the diffusion of knowledge, where building scientists do experiments, report on them, and there's a sense that a rising tide sort of lifts all boats, that if you publish your results, it's not so much that the competition will take advantage of it, although as we'll see that happens, but the idea that you're pushing the entire industry ahead. So here is an example of an early, or sort of actually late, I guess, orangery, but one that is certainly pre-ferro-vitreous construction. And this is what an orangery would have looked like in the 1600s, and this one just happens to be from 1700. And you can see a couple of things here. One is that this is a woodcut done during the summer. So all of the trees are in pots, and they've been brought out to enjoy the mild French summer or Dutch summer. But you can see that the building itself has a couple of things that make it clear that that's about keeping plants alive during the winter. For one, you can see that there are 4 chimneys, so fireplaces that are going constantly, trying to keep the space inside warm. And then you can see that the wall has a series of windows in it. To our eyes, those don't look like tremendously large windows, but they are as big as they can be, given that this is a brick structure. So those brick piers are doing the job of holding up heavy wooden trusses and probably a slate roof. And glass also still relatively expensive, still produced in relatively small pieces. Those windows are probably about as large as would be affordable. So by our standards, not a whole lot of daylight coming in, but enough to keep the orange trees alive, if not particularly happy during the winter. And this is sort of the beginning. This is like an early stab at what a greenhouse would look like. Well, just 50 years later, same country, we can start to see the results of industrialization in a couple of ways. This is an agricultural shed. It's not a sort of aristocratic orangery, but it has the same purpose as the brick and glass building that we just looked at. And you can see several differences, right? One is that it's an iron building. If you look at the section, you can see that the roof is held up by what are clearly iron purlins and then iron props that come up from the ground. And if you look at the elevation, you can see that that allows for much greater area in terms of glass. Also true that by 1750, with improvements in the cylinder process and some mechanization, using coal, for instance, instead of timber for fuel, glass becomes a little bit more affordable and thus able to stretch out over the elevation significantly more. So smaller structure, a lighter roof in this case too, iron instead of timber, and as you can see, the glass begins to fill the openings that are left by this more spindly skeletal structure. There are experiments that look at finding ways to put glass kind of on the roof too, and making sure that you can take advantage of every bit of sun that you get during the winter in Northern Europe. The sun is low in the sky, so the walls make sense, but it's high enough that you would still want a transparent roof. And here, J.C. Loudon, the horticulturist that I mentioned previously, comes up with a system that he calls the ridge and furrow system. And this is basically a way of solving two problems at once. The flat plane of the forcing frame glass front is only perpendicular to the sun once a day. So the sun's rays are less and less effective as they portend a shallow and shallower angle to the glass, more if it gets reflected than transmitted. So by making this angled ridge, you have two periods during the day, right? Mid-morning and mid-afternoon when the sun is perpendicular, and that lessens the amount of sunlight that's lost by reflecting at a shallow angle off of the glass. More importantly, maybe, in Northern Europe, you not only have cold winters, but you have rainy winters. So the ridge and furrow system offers a way to collect the rainwater that would land on this roof and shed it off instead of having it leak through a flat glass surface on the roof of the building. Now, interestingly, Loudon does these experiments that you see on the right, where he basically draws through several ways of structuring still relatively small pieces of glass, right? Still cylinder glass, so artisanally produced small panes. He looks at structuring them with wooden mullions and comes up with systems that allow him to calculate the percentage of glass that you would be left with. And as you can see, the ridge and furrow system that he comes up with is kind of the second most efficient, right? Better than some of the other mullion systems that he can think of. So there is a kind of building science that's going into this. This is parallel to some of the early developments in structural iron and developing theories of iron structure. This is sort of developing a theory of building cladding, right? At least for horticultural uses. What does that look like in practice? We don't have any of Loudon's buildings left, but we do have this one woodcut of a conservatory that he built in Yorkshire, so far northern England, where the climate problems are at their worst. And you can see that there are a couple of very clever things going on here. One is that the shape of this conservatory is round, and the section of it's round in section and in plan. And what that means is that as the sun moves in its more or less circular path through the sky, it's always going to have a perpendicular surface somewhere that it's shining through. So it's a way of sort of passively tracking the sun, not overly efficient, but at least a nod toward accepting that perpendicular radiation whenever it can. And it's also composed of a single section that's rotated around the central axis. And this means a couple of things. One is that Loudon only needs to do one drawing, and he basically has the whole building done, right? The one section just gets repeated over and over again. But it also means that he can take the two trades that he has to work with, the iron workers who are making the wrought iron ribs for the structure, and the glass makers who are making the skin, and he can reduce their efforts down to a couple of very, very simple shapes that are mass-produced. Today we would say that he's simplifying the algorithm, right? He's making the instructions that he has to give the workers very, very simple, right? By making the problem, by simplifying the problem down to basically one move. And we can see this in other conservatories as well. This becomes a big problem, right? How do you take these still very expensive, still very new technologies and make them as efficient as possible? And one way is to use the same shapes over and over again, so that you can use the same jigs and molds for the wrought iron that's coming off of the rollers, and you can use the same templates for all of the glass panes that go into the structure. So here's a gardener, horticulturist named Joseph Paxton, who builds a giant greenhouse for a private client, the so-called Great Stove. You can see that it is designed both for small trees in the kind of lower register and much larger species in the upper register. And it's a reasonably attractive building. It has a fairly pompous entrance to the right, but you can see it's clearly going to do its job, right? It has ridge and furrow glazing, so it's efficiently bringing in the sun. And in section, you can see that Paxton does the same thing that Loudon was doing. He breaks the problem down to a single section that he can draw, and he can tell in this case, the wrought iron and cast iron manufacturers, here are the two pieces, the curved arcs that the wrought iron producers are going to make. There is the column that the cast iron producers are going to manufacture. There's a kind of strut. You can see the drawing in the lower right of the sheet on the left. That's showing the strut that's going to brace one column to the next, and you're pretty much done, right? That is essentially the entire building simplified or distilled down to a couple of shapes. And what this means too is that the glass manufacturers can just produce sheet after sheet after sheet to exactly the same dimensions without worrying about where they're going to go or what kind of variations have to happen on this particular piece. They're mass producing the skin of the building. The glass is going to get cut to shape on site where it has to meet in these kind of mitered corners, but in the workshop it's just going to come out piece after piece that are exactly the same. That section is basically the only drawing that you really need for the entire building. Right, and that enables you to give the workmen, the artisans, and the fabricators a very, very simple set of instructions, and get the efficiency of mass production. Even though it's an artisanal process, you're still getting the efficiency of that kind of mass production process. Paxton gains a great reputation from the Great Stove. He's hired by increasingly wealthy and powerful clients to build hot houses for their own collection of tropical species. He is outdone, though, by a pair of rivals, a builder and horticulturist named Decimus Burton and Richard Turner, who get a royal commission for the so-called Palm House at Kew Gardens, which is the royal families, in this case Victoria and Albert's collection of exotic plants in West London. And this takes some of the ideas of Paxton. It's not ridge and furrow glazing, but as you'll see, it's a clear nod in the direction of that section anyway of the Great Stove, and blows it up to kind of new lengths and heights. The Palm House is about a football field long, so about 100 meters, and it's about 40 feet or 13 meters high. So a huge amount of space to house the palm trees that are coming from around the Commonwealth. And again, a very, very simple set of instructions that you're giving to the iron fabricators and the glass fabricators. So you can see here that there is one arc that's repeated again and again and again, both in the lower and upper stories. There are cast iron columns that support all of the wrought iron structure above. There are a handful of fairly fancy connecting pieces, but the bulk of the iron structure is just this one rolled wrought iron piece that's bent to a consistent radius. And Burton and Turner also, to their credit, sort of perfect this underground steam system that replaces the kind of fireplaces of the old orangeries with a much more controllable and much less polluting, at least within the environment of the palm house, system of keeping it warm. Now, one thing to note is that all of this is, of course, single glazing, right? There's no insulation quality, essentially, in the buildings. So they're taking coal and like using that to just throw energy at the problem. Something that we would balk at today, but at the time, with this abundant source of fuel in coal, it's economically appropriate, at least given the price of fuel versus the intended function. And as you can see, the architectural impact of this is just incredible, right? This is as lightweight and transparent a structure as we've seen to this point. It's the size of some of the larger buildings that we've looked at. It compares, at least in floor plan, with some of the Gothic cathedrals. But of course, you're seeing not so much the skeleton as the sky when you look up. And this not only achieves the goal of keeping Her Majesty's palms alive, but it really does sort of spark the public's imagination, right? Here is a brand new way of constructing something that is lighter, that is more kind of light-filled, more transparent than anything that humans have ever built before, right? And it's all due to these two materials, iron and glass, that are coming together and forming this new construction typology that now is going to get applied to a number of different functional needs. So one of those functional needs is a new type of building that is the exposition hall. The so-called Great Exposition of 1851 is a royally sanctioned event that is going to be hosted by Great Britain, and they're going to invite all of the industrialized countries to send whatever their kind of best products are. And it's a way of sort of celebrating the industrial age. Britain, by hosting it, is pointing out that they are the kind of heart and soul of the world's industrialization. But it's also a sort of keen understanding that the competition between countries or between countries' industries is going to be helpful if it leads to improvements, right? If you know that another country is better at manufacturing something, you might look at your own country's industry and try to improve it. So it's a very kind of Enlightenment, very sort of progressive aim. One of the problems, of course, is that they need a building to put all of these exhibits in. And so the organizers hold a competition to build what will be the largest volume building on the planet by far. There is a limited budget and there's a limited time, less than 2 years, to design and construct the exposition hall. And as you can see from some of the entries here, it's clear that the world's, or Great Britain's and Europe's architects and builders just clearly don't get it, right? Most of the entries are brick structures. Some of them, as you see on the left, have iron domes, but they are all absolutely massive, and they're all going to take years to build, right? These are all efforts at producing basically hand-built exposition halls, and there's no way any of them can meet the deadline. One of the exceptions, but one that still makes the organizers nervous, is Decimus Burton's entry that you see in the lower right, which is for an iron shed, and you can see some things that he's learned from building the Palm House, right? Mass producing the iron, using cast and wrought iron to produce a reasonably stiff shed, and using glass occasionally to bring in daylight. The organizers, though, don't think that any of these are going to work. They don't think that Burton and Turner's scheme is viable either, and they essentially cancel the competition. They do, however, go to Burton's rival in the construction of these hothouses, Joseph Paxton, And they ask him basically if he can put together a late entry. And they do this in a slightly underhanded way. Paxton goes away and thinks about it and produces what is probably one of the greatest architectural drawings of all time. This is the section that he draws on a blotter pad while he's kind of doodling away, basically during a meeting. And as we'll see in the next segment, this is his recognition that not only does he need to produce a building, a thing, but he needs to think through the process, right? He needs to think through how, with a very, very limited amount of time and a very limited budget, he can rethink the way buildings are built in Great Britain and can take advantage of these industries that are young but by now established, glass and iron, and construct something that is basically the world's largest and one of its first and most impressive fully industrialized buildings.